Knees collapsing inwardly just looks like it hurts. When the knees go in, we know that there's a lot of stress being placed on the knee itself, but there's also surrounding tissues that are involved, as well as structures we should consider if we want to fully understand what's going on with this problem and what we can do to correct it. Let's start up top, as I usually do, with the pelvis and how this is going to affect what's going on down below at the knee. So when you see a knee valgus or an inwardly collapsing knee, whether that's during squatting, running, walking, standing, whatever, the femur is going to be put into internal rotation like this. And then what happens down below at the tibia, the lower leg bone, is it turns out into external rotation. So you have this going in and this turning out, so you can see how that's going to crank the knee inward. Now the reason why the femur is in internal rotation in the first place is because the pelvis is going to be oriented into an anterior pelvic tilt orientation, like so. Now some people are just naturally biased towards this position in and of itself. This usually puts the foot in a relative amount of pronation to go with it. So this individual will have trouble finding their heels. Heels are really important here because heels are associated with more external rotation. In gait, when we walk, we should strike the ground with the lateral border of our heel. If we can't do that, then we're probably going to go into excess amounts of pronation. These individuals are probably biased towards that more so than others. So if they can't find their heel, they're not going to be able to start off gait and heel strike with a relatively externally rotated femur and pelvis, and then they're going to struggle to then go into internal rotation because they're already biased to that. Another thing that you can have happen is you can have a pelvis that's originally biased towards an open state, a wider pelvis. And I'm exaggerating this just to illustrate my point here, but these are generally females with a more narrow frame. When you have a wider pelvis like this, the femur is biased towards external rotation because that's what the pelvis is in. So when you see this femur that's turned outward like this, you can see how the angle from the top of the shaft of the femur all the way down to where it connects to the knee is going to be greater than when you're in this orientation right here. So if you have an individual whose pelvis is open like this and their femurs are biased towards external rotation because that's what their pelvis is biased towards, and they go to do something heavy like squatting, or they're going to go do a cut in a sport, or they're going to go jump, that requires a high degree of internal rotation because internal rotation is heavily paired with force production. And when that happens, the pelvic floor spreads apart so that we can spring ourselves up. It's almost like using momentum that allows our femurs to come inward like this. But if we lack the ability to internally rotate, what you can see is an inwardly collapsing of the knees, which will help them in a compensatory way find that internal rotation, which is going to spring up the pelvic floor for them and help them produce force and compress their pelvis in an attempt to produce that force. So how do individuals with this pelvic presentation end up with that knocked knee look during standing? Due to the demand of the constraints placed on this individual's body throughout their life, this could be their job, this could be their sport, this could be how they train at the gym, a lot of different things. But their body has deemed that they are better off being in a forward pelvic orientation, anterior pelvic tilt. That is where you are being pushed forward, like so. And their back extensors are probably the ones that are pushing them forward from the back. And that brings their pelvis in an absolute orientation like this, forward. So they pick up some internal rotation, but their pelvis overall started in that externally rotated state. So the number one thing that we need to do is get out of this anterior pelvic tilt orientation. The best resource I have on this is a free ebook I've released with my buddy Kyle Wall. That's the No BS Guide to Anterior Pelvic Tilt. I will link it down below. This guide is great because it's a semi-individualized assessment process where it's going to help you see what your own individual limitations are and what you can do with exercises to help correct your anterior pelvic tilt. So through this, you should be able to find heel reference because that's what a lot of the exercises are about. And it's also going to help you reposition your pelvis so you're not so much biased towards that internal rotation and you can access external rotation as necessary. The next step in the process would be to own internal and external rotation within your pelvis. Don't give your pelvis a reason to compensate and find internal or external rotation where it doesn't have it. The body is an amazing compensator and it is not afraid to go out of its way to make sure that you can find internal rotation when you need it, even if that is in a knee valgus moment. So what we need to do is exercises to promote internal or external rotation. If you want to know what you're probably lacking, I have another video in the description that I will link that will help you find what your limitations are and a couple of exercises you can do to help restore those things.